Welcome back to episode 3 of Spider-Man Origins, which is a fan-made origin story for Peter B. Parker from Into the Spider-Verse. Before I get into the video, I want to mention that the clips from the Spider-Man PS4 video game shown on the screen are meant to display the time of day and suit Peter is currently in, to give somewhat of a visual representation of what is going on, and for reference, the Spider-Clan suit, which will be shown in a moment, will represent Peter in his civilian clothes because it has a smaller body type, and I think that just fits him being a 15-year-old kid, while the official Spider-Verse costume is meant to represent him wearing his real Spider-Man suit. The third episode begins at the exact moment episode 2 left off at, with Peter looking down the street at his house surrounded by cop cars and flashing lights. He quickly changes into his civilian clothes and this time remembers to put his web shooters on his wrists instead of leaving them in his bag along with his suit. He enters the house to see Aunt May crying alongside one of her friends, Anna Watson, while the house is flooded with police officers and a covered body is being pulled out on a stretcher. Peter asks an officer what happened and he's told that a man who has been identified as Benjamin Parker was recently shot and murdered in a house burglary. In the background of the shot, we see a cop lift his radio to his ear before telling the others that the man was seen fleeing the neighborhood and entering an abandoned warehouse at the edge of Queens. He gives them an address, and soon after, a group of officers come filing out of the house, getting into their cars and racing down the street in the direction of the building. Peter takes a quick glance back at Aunt May before rushing out the front door behind them. Without hesitation, Peter immediately swings toward the warehouse to see the face of the man who murdered Uncle Ben. We get a short flashback from the previous episode when the same thief passes by Peter during the store robbery after his dinner with Harry. Peter begins to pummel the man, and when he cries for help in agony, Peter remembers the last thing his uncle had told him. This is another flashback scene, and during this entire sequence, Peter is still unmasked, showing the immense amounts of regret and rage boiling inside of him. Remembering this conversation, Peter immediately begins to pull his punches, instead webbing the criminal to the wall for the cops to find and clean up themselves. He begins to flee the scene as the armed officers enter the building when one cop spots and shouts at him, telling him to hold it right there. Peter swings out of sight, his face being shielded by the black of midnight, before the man is found by the other officers, who find this form of capture extremely dissimilar to anything they've seen before. Peter starts to swing downtown back to his home in Queens when he drops onto the top of a building and begins to cry. He instead decides to walk the rest of the way home, and upon arrival, he sees MJ standing in front of his house. The police cars have left by now, and when Peter meets her at the end of the driveway, she gives him a hug. After a few moments, Mary Jane tells Peter not to worry about May because she's with her Aunt Anna at the moment, who is trying to help her cope with the tragedy. When Peter walks inside, we see him throw both suits in anger to the back of his closet and slam it shut. The next scene takes place at Uncle Ben's funeral, where most of the characters introduced thus far are seen grieving alongside Peter. Some of these include Harry, MJ, Aunt May, Anna Watson, Randy Robertson, and Flash Thompson. After the funeral, the others give their condolences to him, including Flash, who up to this point has seemed to have formed a rivalry with Peter. During the funeral, he can be seen standing near the edge of the crowd apart from his usual friend group. This is meant to show that although Flash typically presents himself as the classic tough high school jock who chooses to protect his ego, he's still a good person who cares about others, but instead chooses not to express it in front of certain people. Harry also tries to sympathize with Peter, but obviously he's never gone through anything like this, so he isn't the best at dealing with these types of situations. Nevertheless, he still tries to be a good friend, and once everyone is left, we get a scene of Peter and Aunt May standing in front of Uncle Ben's grave together, hugging. The next scene takes place at Oscorp with Harry and his father, Norman. He tells him about the funeral he just attended for Peter's uncle, and Norman seems to show interest despite usually taking the back seat when it comes to fatherhood. He asks Harry when and how Peter's uncle died, and Harry replies by telling him that he was murdered in a house burglary a couple of days ago. Norman takes a moment to digest the information before sending his son off to finish up schoolwork. Over the course of their relationship, Norman has always shown more interest in having Harry become a successful student rather than being a good father to his son, often hiring tutors to help him with his studies as opposed to giving any guidance himself. With the immense amount of success Oscorp has achieved, Norman is often more influenced by the business side of things and believes that he's doing his part by supporting the family financially. Because of this, he doesn't see a need for himself to take up the mantle of raising a son, and when Harry leaves the room, Norman picks up the phone and dials a number. The same voice of the man Norman hired at the end of episode 1 is heard over the phone. He refers to him as the chameleon and asks if he was the one who killed Peter's uncle, and the man tells Norman that he was not, but that he was at the funeral and believes he's getting closer. This is meant to show that the murder of Uncle Ben wasn't a setup and could easily have been prevented if it wasn't for Peter's selfishness, unlike some other adaptations where his death is intentional and pre-planned by major Spider-Man villains. The following scene takes place at school the next day, and despite the situation, Peter knows that it's important to continue to move forward as a person, and in this case as a student. Here we finally get to see Peter taking responsibility for his actions as he enters the principal's office on his own and admits to bringing a few of the school's chemicals home for a personal experiment. He then reimburses the school with some of the money earned from the wrestling event, and the principal thanks him for his honesty, and once he leaves the office, Flash is seen waiting outside and begins to tease Peter. As we see him exit the school and begin to walk home, he eventually passes by a small gang mugging an elderly woman in the depths of an alleyway. With the help of his newfound powers, Peter stops the crime and makes sure the woman is okay before one of the men shouts that he's seen his face and will find him. This makes Peter come to the realization that doing good can sometimes have its consequences, and that if he's going to be saving average civilians from dangerous people, he's going to have to find a way to protect himself without putting loved ones in danger. On his way home, Peter comes to the conclusion that pairing a Spider-Man suit with his new abilities would do exactly that, as his powers would allow him to protect people in need of saving, while the suit would ensure that none of Peter's loved ones, specifically Aunt May, are put in danger by hiding his identity. Peter sees this as a way to escape the grief caused by Uncle Ben's death, as he can now do good for the sake of his uncle and the people of New York. A couple of days go by and Peter's been wearing a Spider-Man suit under his clothes and has been stopping minor crimes that have sprung up around town. The city has begun to take notice of this masked hero, and questions circulate about whether this so-called Spider-Man is really a man. The city seems to have mixed reviews on the webhead, while Peter's classmates at school are all for him. Flash often brags about how he was one of the first people to see Spider-Man in action when he attended the Ed Sullivan Show, and Peter's other classmates, including Harry, Randy, and MJ, seem to have taken a liking to the hero as well. At this point, there have only been eyewitnesses, as no one has actually been able to get physical evidence of Spider-Man in action. But as Peter's life as Spider-Man seems to be thriving, Aunt May continues to struggle with money. Without Uncle Ben, she's left to become the main provider for the family and isn't making enough to pay her basic house bills. She tries to hide this from Peter, but he knows and realizes that the work he's currently doing isn't going to pay the bills either. Abandoning this new persona isn't an option, as Peter believes he's finally found a noble purpose as a teenage superhero, when one day, as he's walking to school, he passes by a poster for the Daily Bugle. It's an ad that's offering a $300 reward for the first person that can get a good photo of Spider-Man, and remembering the job offer from Robbie in the previous episode, Peter gets the idea to pair his superheroics with photography by selling pictures of his battles to the Daily Bugle as a part-time job. Later that morning in Mrs. Connor's biology class, Flash is assigned to be lab partners with MJ, while Peter is put with Randy. Peter sees this as a problem, as he believes that the more time Flash and MJ spend together, the lower his chances are of getting together with her. Peter insists that he and Flash swap places so Randy and Flash can work together, but the teacher doesn't budge. During this scene, we get a montage of Flash and MJ having a great time together, while Peter and Randy seem to have absolutely no chemistry whatsoever. At the end of class, Flash and MJ are seen leaving together, and Peter begins to become a little jealous. He tells Harry about his problem, and Harry mentions that he had already warned Peter of what was to come, and that if he wants to prevent anything more from happening, he'll have to make a move quickly. With the way things have gone lately, Peter isn't sure that now is the time to take that next step, partly due to his nervous and awkward personality, but also because he doesn't want to bite off more than he can chew. He already plans on getting a job at the Bugle while also being Spider-Man on the side. Along with this, he and Aunt May are still grieving the loss of Uncle Ben and have no idea what the future will bring. In need of money, Peter sets out to grab some photos of Spider-Man in action for the Bugle. Instead of using a stand for his camera, he webs it to the top of a lamppost and swings by a couple of times posing for the shots. However, with this being New York and specifically Queens, there's almost always something mischievous that is bound to be happening. To Peter's luck, in a sense, he happens to stumble across a robbery in progress, and this time around he takes action and stops the criminals, leaving them attached to the inside walls of the building to be found by the police. Along with this, Peter gets the idea to set up his camera and take pictures of himself next to the captured criminals, and before he leaves, he places a note on the webbing covering one of the criminals with the words, "Courtesy of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man." Satisfied with the pictures, Peter heads off to the Bugle to present the photos to the head editor of the paper, and when he gets to the newspaper office, he's immediately overwhelmed by the fast-paced, seemingly chaotic work environment. However, what he doesn't yet know is the amount of difficulty he will soon have to face when he meets the man he wishes to be employed by. As the episode comes to a close, we hear the booming, robust voice of a middle-aged man shouting at the top of his lungs before the scene cuts to black, revealing the end credits. Anyway, that is going to do it for this episode. I hope y'all enjoyed. If you did, make sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're new, and I will see y'all in the next one. I'm out.